Hey guys, and welcome to the next video on Chapter 12, the Silk Roads. So the last video we discussed, kind of the whole concept of the trans-regional trade routes known as the Silk Roads, and we talked about a lot of tangible goods that were bought and sold and traded in between Asia and the Mediterranean. Today we're going to be talking about transferences that are non-tangible, such as religion and disease. So first, start off talking about the spread of Buddhism. Buddhism started in northern India back in the 500s BCE, and really established itself as a legitimate religion in that area under the rule of Ashoka. All right, we talked about him a couple chapters ago with his conversions to Buddhism in the 3rd century. And from there, it spread north. And it really first became an established religion in this area in oasis towns. These oasis towns, they relied on the money that it brought into it. The Buddhists would establish monasteries, and then pilgrims would come in there. And so it was a symbiotic relationship between the oasis towns and Buddhism. From there, it spread into the Central Asian steppes, this region up through here. Today would be your Stan countries, Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and so forth. And finally, by the 1st century BCE, it made its way into China. Now, it was not readily accepted in China, but it did eventually kind of take a hold with Buddhist monasteries at the far end of the Silk Road. Now, Hinduism never really made its way much north, or certainly not northeast into China, but it did make its way down into these regions in Southeast Asia. Today would be Thailand and Myanmar and Indonesia and so forth, and that started to reach that part of the world about the same time that Buddhism reached China, 1st century BCE. Okay. Spread of Christianity. Now, we talked about this a little bit in the previous chapter on Rome, and during the early days of Christianity, they were famed for being persecuted by the Romans, and a lot of that came back to the Christians' refusal to acknowledge the divinity of the emperor. The same problem that the Romans had with the Jews, it was transferred to the Christians, and so there were all sorts of, fun punishments for them, such as feeding them to the lions and so forth. But it did spread, and it took advantage of the Roman road and trade routes that we talked about in the previous chapter as well. Right? If Christianity started down here in Judea, you can see that while you don't necessarily have the road network up in Europe, there were still some very well-established roads that you could travel north into, through places like Antioch, and then that would bring you into Anatolia, what would be Turkey. You could take those to the Mediterranean and Greece and so forth, and also road networks that would take you through North Africa. Now, missionary work was always very, very important for early Christianity. I remember what we talked about Paul. There were other figures such as Gregory the Wonder Worker. And so that was always a big aspect of early Christian culture, was to go out there and try and get more converts. So you see on the map here, purple, 185, the spread of Christianity. So within, the first 2 centuries after Jesus' death, first 150 years, it had done some impressive spreading, up through here, the Near East and so forth. But then by the time of Constantine in 325, you can see how extensive the spread was, particularly through the Middle East, and then large sections of Europe, all of Italy, all of Greece, and then big sections of the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, Gaul, which is France, and even some pockets up here in Britain as well. Some going on down around here, excuse me, in Egypt and North Africa. Not too much up here into the Germanic regions. Okay, they wouldn't really start to convert to Christianity in large numbers until after the fall of the Western Empire. But still, it was some very impressive spreading. By the 2nd century, it was one of the more dominant religions in the Middle East. And it would be one of the largest religious communities in the Middle East up until the Islamic conquest in the 7th century. Because of this dominance in the eastern portion of the Roman Empire, there was a heavy influence of Eastern ascetic culture. I remember asceticism is doing away with worldly pleasures. Well, that had an awful lot of influence on early Christian monastic orders. You think of monks that take vows of poverty and vows of silence and isolate themselves. An awful lot of that didn't come from original European influence. The Germanic tribes didn't do any of that. That all came from ascetic religions that happened more in the eastern part of the empire. Okay. So it starts to spread, but it also needs to be legitimized. It needs to be legitimized by the Roman Empire and by the people of Rome. And this officially happens in 313 with the Edict of Milan. Emperor Constantine at the time, he kind of basically orders it, and it legitimizes Christianity. It says that it doesn't make it the official religion of the Roman Empire just yet, but it says that they are no longer to be prosecuted and that they are to be accepted in all ranks and rungs of society. A couple of decades later, in 380 CE, Emperor Theodosius would then make Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. And from there, it was established that Christianity was going to be the official religion of Europe. But it also, it expanded in its influence before this, in order to get to this part, it expanded its influence. It wasn't just looked at as a salvation religion among the commoners. It also gained intellectual legitimacy and respectability. And a lot of this was due to this guy, Augustine of Hippo. He made Christianity intellectually respectable. It wasn't just a bunch of commoners out there talking about salvation and so forth. His writings, it appealed to the upper class elites. It appealed to the educated, philosophers and so forth. And so Augustine's influence had a very far-reaching effect throughout the different ranks of Roman society. Now, eventually they said, well, if we're going to be respectable and if we're going to be official, we have to centralize the church. And they did this through creating, different offices. Here you have the 5 original patriarchs. You see, this is in 381, CE, AD, same thing. You got Rome, you got Constantinople, you got Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria. Now, even though it says down here that the Bishop of Constantinople would have, prerogative, as they say, over Rome, the Bishop of Rome still viewed himself as being, superior to the others, because he looked at himself as being the inheritor of St. Peter, the original apostle, right, the rock, as Jesus put it, but also because Rome was Rome. Rome was the classical capital of the empire. Eventually, the Bishop of Rome took the title of Pope, right? From the Latin term for father. And this eventually would give rise to a hierarchy where you have the Pope at the top, the Bishop of Rome, then cardinals, archbishops, and bishops. The bishops preside over dioceses, right? Dioceses, you can't see it because it's red on red, didn't think of that. But dioceses are kind of your territories in Catholicism, and, we still have that. So the Bishop of Buffalo, it's not just for the city of Buffalo, it would also be for most of Western New York, including Rochester, as in that diocese. Then you have priests, deacons, and then the laity, which is everybody. All right, some other Christian faiths. You do have some, minor offshoots of Christianity that evolved during this time, such as Nestorianism. That was, they were followers of the Greek philosopher Nestorius. And this was big on, kind of the division of, the human aspect of Jesus and the divine aspect of Jesus. Especially they emphasized the human nature of Jesus. A much bigger one was Manichaeism. Manichaeism was founded by this philosopher, this guy Mani. He was born in what today would be present-day Iraq, and this was in the Persian Empire, so he was a Zoroastrianist. And he stressed this syncretic blend of different philosophies. He said Zarathustra for Zoroastrianism, Buddha for Buddhism, Christ for Christianity. He says they're all kind of talking about the same thing. He says, and they don't necessarily have to be exclusive of one another. So this was a great example of a syncretic religion, of blending different religions into one, but without necessarily forming a new one. They still consider themselves Christian. Here's an example of this synchronism. You look at this quickly and you think that it's Buddha, but then you look a little closer and you see, the cross and so forth, and you realize that this is actually a depiction of Christ, but, with a very, very heavy Eastern influence in there. So this blending, this mixing of it, you see. It also discussed, kind of this good versus evil. There was the appeal of personal salvation. He stressed an ascetic lifestyle. And Manichaeism had definitely spread along trade routes. It was not accepted very well within the Roman Empire. In fact, it was basically stamped out in the Roman Empire and eventually the Sasanian Empire as well, because they stressed Zoroastrianism so much. Where it took hold was more in the East, and you do find Manichaeism, Christianity in China even to this day. Okay, spread of disease as well. It's not just good stuff, it's bad stuff that spreads along trade routes. And, travelers, merchants, and whatnot, they spread disease. It's an unfortunate, unintended consequence of trade. And a very nasty one that spread in the 2nd century CE was the Antonine plague. I'm sorry. And this really devastated Rome. It probably was an outbreak of smallpox based on accounts. They didn't classify it as smallpox back then. But smallpox, measles, even early kind of versions of the bubonic plague, not the Black Death, that was a separate one. But this one in 165 through 180, this reduced, the Roman Empire's population from 60 million to 40 million. It also claimed the life of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Now, a big impact of this was that trade declines, right? So you figure, okay, that makes sense. People are realizing that they're dying on trade routes, so they're not going to go out and trade anymore. But another one is that because trans-regional trade declines, it leads to much more of a sense of regional self-sufficiency. Economies become more regional, because they're not relying on trade from the Far East. Rome isn't getting Chinese silks or jade and horses from Central Asia anymore. So they have to focus more on domestic goods. And likewise in Han China, because this had devastating impacts. It killed millions of people in China as well. So it didn't end trans-regional trade, but it had a very debilitating impact on it. Okay, so that's it on the spread of religion and disease. And for the next and final one, we'll talk about the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and the Han Dynasty.